The smell of star anise and ginger root had filled the small storefront on Magnolia Street for 43 years. Every morning at 5:30, Mrs. Nguyen unlocked the wooden door with the hand-painted sign that read, "Hoa my herbal remedies," in both Vietnamese and English. By 6, the copper pots would be simmering on the back burner, steam carrying the scent of traditional medicine her grandmother taught her to prepare in the Central Highlands before the war. On a cold Tuesday morning in March, Mrs. Nguyen arrived to find a yellow paper stapled to her door. Notice of condemnation, blighted property 30 days to vacate. Her hands trembled as she read the official city letterhead. 43 years she had operated this shop. 43 years of preparing remedies for back pain, insomnia, digestive problems, grief. The neighborhood knew her copper pots the way they knew their own heartbeats. Mrs. Nguyen was 78 years old. She had survived the fall of Saigon, a refugee camp in the Philippines, and the brutal first years in America when no one understood her language or her medicine. She had watched her husband die young from the chemicals he carried in the war. She had raised 3 children alone in the apartment above this shop. She had never cried in front of customers. But when Mr. Tran from the pho restaurant next door found her sitting on the doorstep with the yellow notice in her lap, tears streaming down her weathered face, he knew something had broken that could not be fixed with tiger balm or ginseng tea. Within 2 hours, every Vietnamese business owner on Magnolia Street had received the same notice. Within 4 hours, the entire community knew that their neighborhood, the only place in the city where Vietnamese was spoken more than English, where the smell of fish sauce and lemongrass marked the boundaries like an invisible wall, was being erased. The notice said, "Blighted." The community knew the truth. Someone wanted them gone. Mrs. Nguyen's youngest son, Tan, called her that evening from across town. He listened to his mother's voice crack as she described the notice. He heard 43 years of resilience crumble in a single phone call. Tan Nguyen had another name on the streets. The Hells Angels knew him as Stitch. And when Stitch learned that someone had threatened his mother's life's work, he made a single phone call to the clubhouse on Industrial Boulevard. "We need to talk," he said. "Someone's trying to destroy Little Saigon." The president of the charter, a man called Reaper, asked one question, "Your mother good people?" "Best person I know," Stitch answered. "Then we ride tomorrow." What neither of them knew yet was that the yellow notices on Magnolia Street were just the visible edge of something much darker. A conspiracy that stretched from City Hall to corporate boardrooms 3 states away. A plan that had been in motion for 18 months, executed with the precision of a military operation. And at the center of it all was a name that Mrs. Nguyen would recognize from a different lifetime. A name that would make her close her eyes and whisper, "Not again. Please, not again."
Before we continue with what happened next, I need to ask you something important. This story is about ordinary people standing up against powerful interests that see communities as nothing more than real estate opportunities. It's about cultural preservation, family, and the cost of fighting for dignity in a system rigged against you. If you believe that corporations shouldn't be allowed to erase entire communities for profit, hit that like button right now. Not for the algorithm, but because every like tells YouTube that stories about real injustice matter more than celebrity gossip. Subscribe if you want more stories about people who refuse to be erased. And share this with someone who needs to understand that resistance isn't always loud. Sometimes it's a 78-year-old herbalist refusing to abandon the place where she's healed her community for 4 decades. Now let's talk about what Stitch discovered when he started asking questions.
Stitch arrived at his mother's shop the next morning with 3 other Hells Angels, Reaper, a man called Bones, and a younger member named Jimmy who handled the club's legal research. They wore their cuts, leather vests with the death's head patch, but they'd come to listen, not intimidate. Mrs. Nguyen served them tea in small ceramic cups, the kind she reserved for respected guests. She placed a plate of bon delon, layered Vietnamese steamed cake, on the table between them. Even in crisis, hospitality mattered. "Tell us everything, Mrs. Nguyen," Reaper said quietly. "Start from the beginning." She showed them the notice. The city had declared the entire 4-block radius of Magnolia Street blighted under Municipal Code 14.3.7. The properties were condemned. Residents had 30 days to accept the city's buyout offer or face eviction and legal proceedings. How much they offering? Bones asked. Mrs. Nguyen slid a second paper across the table. The buyout offer for her building, the shop and the apartment above where she'd lived for 43 years, was $47,000. Jimmy, who'd been quiet until now, looked up sharply. Ma'am, what's this property actually worth? The realtor I spoke to yesterday said at least $380,000, Mrs. Nguyen said. Maybe more. The neighborhood has become, what is the word, trendy. Young people want to live here now. So they're offering you 12% of market value, Jimmy said flatly, and giving you 30 days to decide. Everyone on the street got the same offer, Mrs. Nguyen continued. Mr. Tran, who owns the Pho restaurant. The Chow family with the grocery. The Pham sisters with the nail salon. 40 families, Ton. 40 families who built their lives here. Stitch's jaw tightened. His road name came from his ability to stitch wounds without flinching, to repair what was broken. But looking at his mother's hands trembling around the teacup, he didn't know how to fix this. Who signed the condemnation order? Reaper asked. Mrs. Nguyen showed him the signature line, Department of Urban Development, approved by the Zoning Commission. We need to see the zoning meeting records, Jimmy said. Public information. If they declared an entire neighborhood blighted, there has to be documentation. Inspections. Evidence. I've lived here 43 years, Mrs. Nguyen said softly. The building is old, yes. But blighted? The roof is good. The plumbing works. I repainted last year. This is not blighted, this is convenient. Convenient for who? Bones asked. That was the question that would lead them down a path darker than any of them expected. Jimmy spent 3 days at City Hall, requesting every public record related to the Magnolia Street condemnation. He was met with bureaucratic delays, missing files, and clerks who suddenly couldn't locate documents that should have been readily available. On the 4th day, a young city employee named Sarah approached him in the hallway outside the records department. You're asking about Magnolia Street, she said quietly, glancing around to make sure they were alone. Yeah. You know something? She handed him a flash drive. I could lose my job for this. But what they're doing isn't right. Those are the Zoning Commission meeting minutes from the past 18 months. Read the entries from November. She walked away before Jimmy could ask questions. That night, in the clubhouse on Industrial Boulevard, Jimmy projected the documents onto the wall. Stitch, Reaper, Bones, and 4 other members gathered around. The November 14th Zoning Commission meeting showed a unanimous vote to declare Magnolia Street blighted. But the meeting minutes revealed something disturbing. The vote happened at 11:47 p.m., after a 6-hour session that began with unrelated zoning appeals. They buried it at the end of a marathon meeting, Jimmy explained. When public attendance would be gone. When local media wouldn't be watching. Who proposed the motion? Reaper asked. Jimmy highlighted the name, Commissioner David Walsh. And look at this, Jimmy continued, scrolling to an earlier document. 3 months before the vote, Commissioner Walsh received a $15,000 campaign contribution from something called Meridian Capital Holdings LLC. Stitch leaned forward. What's Meridian Capital? That's where it gets interesting, Jimmy said. Meridian Capital is a shell company, registered in Delaware. But if you follow the ownership structure, he pulled up another screen showing a labyrinth of corporate filings. It's owned by a larger entity called Terramark Development Group. And Terramark is? One of the biggest real estate development corporations in the country. $3 billion in assets. They specialize in what they call urban renewal projects. Jimmy made air quotes with his fingers, which is code for buying up ethnic neighborhoods, displacing residents, and building luxury condos. The room went silent. So a commissioner took money from a development corporation, Bones said slowly, then 3 months later declared the neighborhood blighted so the city could condemn the properties and force residents to sell for pennies? That's exactly what it looks like, Jimmy confirmed. Reaper stood up, pacing the length of the clubhouse. This isn't some local slumlord. We're talking about a billion-dollar corporation with lawyers, political connections, and a plan that's been running for over a year. It's worse than that, Jimmy added. Look at the development proposal submitted to the city in December, 1 month after the condemnation vote. He pulled up architectural renderings. The plans showed the entire Magnolia Street area transformed into Magnolia Heights, a mixed-use development with luxury apartments, upscale retail, a boutique hotel, and a rooftop bar overlooking the city. The tagline on the promotional materials read, "Urban Living Reimagined." "They're going to erase the entire community," Stitch said, his voice barely above a whisper. 43 years of my mother's work. Generations of families. The only place in this city where Vietnamese culture exists like it does. They're going to bulldoze it and put up apartments for people who make 6 figures. And it's completely legal, Jimmy said. As long as the zoning commission declares it blighted, the city can use eminent domain. The families have no legal recourse except to fight the buyout amount in court, which most of them can't afford to do. Reaper stopped pacing. We need to know who's running Terramark. Who's the person behind this? Jimmy pulled up the corporate filing. CEO and primary shareholder is a man named Richard Voss. The name hung in the air. And then Mrs. Nguyen's voice came from the doorway. Voss. Everyone turned. Stitch's mother stood in the entrance to the clubhouse, her face pale. Stitch had called her with updates, and she'd driven over when he mentioned they'd found information. Mom, you know that name? Mrs. Nguyen walked slowly into the room, her eyes fixed on the name on the projection screen. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of decades. Robert Voss, she said. That was the name. In 1983. Who was Robert Voss? Reaper asked gently. Mrs. Nguyen sat down in one of the old leather chairs. When we first came to America, we lived in a different neighborhood, near the docks. The rent was cheap. Many Vietnamese families settled there, maybe 60, 70 families. We called it Little Saigon, the first one. She paused, gathering herself. A developer wanted the land. Man named Robert Voss. He tried to buy us out, but we refused. The community owned our buildings, you understand? We pooled money, bought them together. We thought we were safe. What happened? Stitch asked, though part of him didn't want to know. He went to the city. Said our buildings were unsafe. Fire hazards. Health violations. The inspectors came and suddenly found problems that never existed before. They condemned 3 buildings. Then 5. Then all of them. Mrs. Nguyen's hands tightened in her lap. We had no money for lawyers. No connections. Most of us barely spoke English. We took what they offered, almost nothing, and scattered. Some families left the city entirely. The community broke apart. Everything we built together, gone. She looked up at the name on the screen. Robert Voss built luxury apartments on that land. Made millions. And now. Her voice hardened. Now his son does the same thing. The room was absolutely silent. Richard Voss is Robert Voss's son, Jimmy said, already typing. He pulled up a biographical article about the Terramark CEO. The piece included a photo of Richard Voss standing next to an older man at a ribbon-cutting ceremony. The caption read, Richard Voss left with his father, Robert Voss, founder of Voss Properties, at the grand opening of Harbor Heights, 2018. He learned from his father, Mrs. Nguyen said quietly, how to erase communities, how to use the law as a weapon, how to make it look legitimate. Stitch knelt beside his mother's chair. We're not letting this happen again. How can you stop them? She asked. They have everything, money, lawyers, politicians. We have nothing. Reaper spoke then, his voice carrying the authority that made him president. Mrs. Nguyen, with respect, you're wrong. You have something they don't. What? You have us. And we don't fight fair. The Hells Angels plan was simple in theory, complicated in execution, expose the corruption, pressure the corporation, and force them to offer fair value. But Terramark Development Group hadn't built a $3 billion empire by folding under pressure. The first move came from Stitch. He organized a community meeting at the Vietnamese Community Center on Magnolia Street. Over 200 people showed up, residents, business owners, their children, grandchildren. Mrs. Nguyen stood at the front and told them what she discovered: the bribery, the shell companies, The connection to the developer who destroyed their first community decades ago. They think we'll disappear quietly like we did before, she said in Vietnamese, her voice amplified through a microphone. But we are not the same people we were in 1983. We have lived here for 40 years. We have built businesses. We have raised families. We have earned our place in this city. The room erupted in applause. We're going to fight, Stitch added, speaking in English for the younger generation. But we need everyone united. No one takes their buyout offer. We negotiate together or not at all. A man in the back stood up, Mr. Tran, who owned the pho restaurant. What if they force us out? What if they send police? Then we make sure the whole city is watching when they do it, Reaper said, standing beside Stitch. We document everything. We call the media. We make this so public that every politician in the state has to answer for it. The community voted unanimously. They would refuse the buyout offers. 1 week later, the letters arrived. Not yellow notices this time. White envelopes with the return address of Morrison & Klein Legal Group, one of the most expensive law firms in the state. The letters were addressed to every resident who'd refused the buyout. The language was dense, full of legal terminology, but the message was clear. Accept the current offer within 14 days, or face legal action for defiance of municipal condemnation orders. Continued occupancy of condemned property will result in fines of $500 per day, potential criminal trespassing charges, and liens against any assets used to maintain residence. Mrs. Nguyen brought her letter to Stitch with shaking hands. They're going to arrest us for living in our own homes. Jimmy read through the legal threats with a growing sense of dread. This is aggressive. They're not just pressuring you, they're trying to financially destroy anyone who resists. $500 a day adds up to $15,000 a month. Most of these families can't absorb that. Can they actually do this? Such as legally? It's a gray area. They'd have to enforce it through the courts, which takes time. But the threat alone is enough to scare people. And if they get one family to fold, others will follow. That night, 3 families on Magnolia Street accepted the buyout offers. The community was fracturing. Reaper brought in a contact, a journalist named Maya Chin who worked for the city's alternative weekly newspaper. She'd covered stories about displacement and gentrification before, and she was interested. Maya spent a week interviewing residents, photographing the neighborhood, reviewing the documents Jimmy had uncovered. Her article ran with the headline, "Corporate Giant Accused of Bribing Officials to Displace Historic Vietnamese Community." The story went viral locally. The morning it published, protesters gathered outside City Hall. College students, activist groups, members of other immigrant communities who recognized the pattern. The pressure was building. But Terramark had resources the community didn't. Within 48 hours of Maya's article, Terramark's PR team released a counter-narrative. They held a press conference with slick promotional videos and carefully prepared talking points. Magnolia Street has been designated as blighted by city inspectors using objective criteria. Terramark Development Group is committed to revitalizing underutilized urban areas while providing fair compensation to current residents. The buyout offers meet all legal requirements. Accusations of bribery are baseless and defamatory. We will pursue legal action against any parties spreading false information. They also announced a new initiative. Terramark would donate $100,000 to Vietnamese cultural organizations in the city. It was a masterclass in corporate damage control. The donation made them look generous. The legal threats silenced critics. And the phrase, underutilized urban areas, reframed displacement as economic development. The narrative shifted. Local news stations started reporting it as a complicated issue with valid concerns on both sides. Maya called Stitch frustrated. They're burying the story with money and lawyers. My editor is getting nervous about libel lawsuits. So what do we do? Such as, you need something undeniable. Proof of the bribery that's so clear they can't spin it. But proof was buried in corporate structures, offshore accounts, and campaign finance loopholes that technically weren't illegal, just unethical. They were fighting a system designed to protect exactly this kind of corruption. It came from an unexpected source. Commissioner David Walsh, the man who'd taken the $15,000 contribution and pushed through the condemnation vote, had a daughter named Emily. She was a social worker who'd spent years helping refugee families navigate the immigration system. When Emily Walsh saw her father's name in Maya Chen's article, she confronted him at a family dinner. The argument was vicious. Emily accused her father of betraying everything she'd tried to build in her career. David Walsh defended himself, saying he'd followed the law, that the contribution was legal. That development was good for the city. But Emily knew her father. She'd grown up watching him make compromises that eroded his integrity piece by piece. And she knew he kept records of everything, paranoid about being thrown under the bus by people more powerful than him. 2 days after the argument, Emily Walsh walked into the Vietnamese community center and asked to speak with Stitch. She brought a manila folder. "These are my father's personal notes from the zoning commission meetings," she said quietly. "He keeps detailed records because he doesn't trust Voss or anyone else involved. I made copies." Stitch opened the folder. Inside were handwritten notes documenting conversations that never appeared in official minutes. Voss confirms $15,000 contribution, expects favorable vote on Magnolia project. Meeting with Terramark legal team, assured that condemnation process is standard procedure and will withstand appeals. Voss mentioned other commissioners are on board, coordinated effort. There were also names. 3 other commissioners who'd received contributions from Meridian Capital Holdings. Amounts. Dates. "This is evidence of conspiracy," Jimmy said when Stitch showed him the notes. "This is what we need." But Emily Walsh had one condition. "You can't reveal where you got this. If it comes out that I gave you my father's private notes, it destroys any legal standing. They'll call it theft, claim it's inadmissible, attack the credibility." "So how do we use it?" "Suggest. You leverage it," Emily said. "You let Voss and the commissioners know you have proof. You don't go public yet, you use it to force them to negotiate." I want to pause here because this is where the story gets complicated in a way that matters. Emily Walsh just handed Stitch evidence that could blow this case wide open, but using it means strategic pressure, not public exposure. It means playing a game where powerful people hold most of the cards.
If you've ever felt powerless against a system that protects the wealthy and crushes ordinary people, hit that subscribe button, not because I'm asking, but because stories like this need to be told. Stories about communities that refuse to disappear. Stories about corruption that hides behind legal language and corrupt PR. Share this video with someone who works in the city government, real estate, or community organizing. Let them see what happens when billion-dollar corporations treat neighborhoods like inventory to be liquidated. And drop a comment telling me, have you ever seen this happen in your city? Because I guarantee this story isn't unique to one place. It's a pattern repeating across America. Now let's talk about what happened when Stitch walked into a room with Richard Voss and told him exactly what he knew.
The meeting was arranged through Morrison & Klein, Terramark's law firm. Neutral territory, a conference room in a downtown office building. Richard Voss agreed to meet with community representatives as a gesture of good faith. Stitch walked in wearing his Hell's Angels cut. He brought Reaper and Jimmy. The message was clear: we're not intimidated. Richard Voss was in his early 50s, wearing a suit that probably cost more than Mrs. Nguyen's monthly revenue. He had the polished confidence of someone who'd never lost a fight that mattered. 2 lawyers flanked him. "Gentlemen," Voss said, not standing, "I understand you wanted to discuss the Magnolia Street project." Stitch sat down across from him. "We're here to tell you that we know about the bribes." Voss didn't blink. "That's a serious accusation. I hope you have evidence, because defamation lawsuits are expensive." Jimmy slid a folder across the table. Inside was a summary, not the original notes, but a typed outline of what they contained. Names, dates, contribution amounts, meeting references. One of the lawyers picked it up, scanned it, and whispered something to Voss. Voss's expression didn't change, but Stitch saw the slight tension in his jaw. "Where did you get this?" Voss asked. "Doesn't matter," Stitch said. "What matters is that we have it. And if you proceed with the displacement, we'll make sure every news outlet in the country knows that Terramark Development Group bribed city officials to destroy a Vietnamese immigrant community. Voss leaned back in his chair. Even if this information were accurate, and I'm not conceding that it is, campaign contributions are legal. Developers engage with local government all the time. There's nothing criminal about participating in the political process. Maybe not criminal, Reaper said. But how's it going to look? The son of the developer who displaced the same community in 1983, using the same tactics 40 years later? That's a hell of a story. For the first time, Voss's composure cracked slightly. You've been talking to my father's former tenants. Your father's victims, Stitch corrected. One of them is my mother. She was there in 1983 when Robert Voss destroyed Little Saigon the first time. She remembers. Voss was quiet for a moment. Then he smiled, a cold, calculating expression. Let me be very clear about the situation you're in. Terramark Development Group has $200 million invested in the Magnolia Heights project. We have contracts with construction firms, investors, lenders. We have city approval. We have legal authority. He leaned forward. If you release this information, we will bury you in litigation. We will sue you personally, your motorcycle club, every business owner who participated in your little resistance movement. We have 40 lawyers on retainer who do nothing but handle situations like this. How many lawyers do you have? One, Jimmy said quietly. Exactly. Voss stood up. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to accept our final offer, which I'm generously raising to 20% of market value instead of 12. Your residents will have 60 days instead of 30 to relocate. And in exchange, you'll sign non-disclosure agreements and release Terramark from any legal liability. And if we refuse? Then we proceed with the condemnation. Your residents face daily fines, eviction proceedings, and legal costs they can't afford. And when this is over, and it will be over because we always win, you'll have nothing. No compensation. No community. No leverage. Voss moved toward the door, then paused. I'm not a villain, Mr. Nguyen. I'm a businessman. My father built his company by recognizing opportunity. I'm continuing his legacy. That neighborhood is sitting on prime real estate in a growing city. It's underutilized. We're going to build something that creates jobs, tax revenue, and housing for people who actually contribute to the modern economy. You mean rich people, Reaper said. I mean people who can afford market-rate housing, Voss corrected. Your mother's herb shop is charming, I'm sure. But it's not the highest and best use of that land. The market has spoken. Either adapt or move aside. He left the conference room. The lawyers followed. Stitch sat in silence, staring at the empty chair where Voss had been. He's not bluffing, Jimmy said. Terramark can absolutely drown us in legal costs. And everything he said about the law is technically correct. They have the authority to do this. So we lose. Reaper shook his head. We changed the game. That night, Stitch called another meeting at the community center. He laid out the situation honestly. Terramark had the legal power, the money, and the political connections to force the displacement. Fighting in court would bankrupt the community. But Voss had offered a new deal. 20% of market value instead of 12%, plus 60 days to relocate. It's not enough, Mrs. Nguyen said from the front row. 20% is still robbery. I know, Stitch said, but we need to be realistic about our options. An older man named Mr. Pham stood up. He'd owned the grocery store for 38 years. In 1983, we had no choice because we didn't understand the system. We were new to this country. We didn't speak the language. We didn't know our rights. He looked around the room. But now, we've been here 40 years. We own businesses. We vote. We pay taxes. We have children who are lawyers, doctors, teachers. We are not powerless anymore. So what do you want to do? I want to fight, Mr. Pham said. But I want to fight smart. Reaper stepped forward. We can't win in their system. Courts, lawyers, legal procedures designed to protect corporate interests. But we can win in the court of public opinion. We can make this so expensive for Terramark in terms of reputation and political capital that settling becomes cheaper than fighting. How? Someone asked. We go national, Mayachin said. She'd been sitting in the back, recording the meeting. This isn't just a local story anymore. This is about immigrant communities being erased by corporate greed. This is about corruption in city government. This is about generational injustice, a father and son using the same tactics 40 years apart. She pulled up her phone and showed them social media metrics. My article has been shared 40,000 times. There's already national media interest. If we give them a story they can't ignore, protests, civil disobedience, real human faces, this becomes a referendum on gentrification in every city in America. What does that get us? Mr. Tran asked. Pressure, Reaper said. Politicians hate bad press. Investors hate controversy. If we make Magnolia Heights toxic, if every headline is about displaced immigrants and corporate corruption, the project becomes a liability. And then they negotiate for real, Jimmy added. Not 20%. Fair market value. Real compensation. The room was silent as people absorbed the plan. Finally, Mrs. Nguyen spoke. What you're describing is a war. Not with guns, but with cameras and newspapers and protests. Some of us are old. We're tired. We came to this country to escape war. She stood up slowly. But if we don't fight now, what are we teaching our children? That powerful people can always take what they want? That we should disappear quietly? She looked at Stitch. My son asked me once why I never talked about the fall of Saigon. Why I never told stories about the old country. I told him it's because I didn't want him to carry my pain. I wanted him to be American. To be free. Her voice strengthened. But maybe I was wrong. Maybe our children need to know that freedom isn't given, it's fought for. Every generation has to fight for it again. She looked around the room at the faces of her community. So we fight. We make them see us. We make them know our names. We make this so hard for them that they regret ever thinking we were easy targets. The room erupted in applause. The vote was unanimous. The protests began the next morning. Residents refused to leave their homes. They hung banners from windows, 40 years. 40 families. Not for sale. College students joined them, setting up tents on Magnolia Street in solidarity. Activist groups coordinated social media campaigns. The hashtag Save Little Saigon trended locally, then regionally. News crews arrived. Local stations at first, then CNN, MSNBC. The story had everything: corporate greed, immigrant community, corruption, David versus Goliath. Mrs. Nguyen became the face of the resistance. Camera crews filmed her preparing herbal remedies in her shop, explaining traditional medicine, showing 43 years of photographs on the walls. She spoke about fleeing Saigon, about surviving in refugee camps, about building a life from nothing. They want to call this blighted, she said to one reporter, gesturing at her shop. This is my life. This is my community's life. If we are blighted, then let them say it to our faces while the cameras are rolling. The footage went viral. Terramark's PR team scrambled. They released statements about respecting the concerns of longtime residents, while emphasizing the legal process and economic benefits of development. But the narrative had shifted. Nationally, Magnolia Heights wasn't being seen as urban renewal, it was being seen as cultural erasure. City council members who'd been silent suddenly called for review of the condemnation process. The mayor, facing re-election, announced a community task force to ensure all voices are heard. Richard Voss called an emergency board meeting at Terramark headquarters. But fighting back came with consequences. The daily fines started accumulating. $500 per day, per property. Some families couldn't absorb the cost. They took the 20% offer and left, heartbroken but financially desperate. The city sent building inspectors who suddenly found code violations that had never been mentioned before. Mr. Tran's faux restaurant was cited for inadequate ventilation despite passing inspections for 30 years. Repairs would cost $40,000. Mrs. Nguyen received a notice that her business license was under review due to complaints about medicinal practices not approved by State Health Board. It was systematic harassment, designed to break them. One night, someone spray-painted, "Go back to your country," across the community center wall. Stitch stood in front of the graffiti with his mother, staring at the words. "Maybe they're right," Mrs. Nguyen said quietly. "Maybe we should just take the money and go. This is too hard." "Mom. I'm 78 years old, Ton. I don't have many years left. I don't want to spend them fighting." Stitch took his mother's hand. "You told me once that you came to America because you wanted me to have freedom. You said freedom was worth any sacrifice." "I was young and stupid," she said, trying to smile through tears. "No. You were brave. You still are." Mrs. Nguyen looked at the graffiti, then back at her son. "What if we lose?" "Then we lose fighting," Stitch said. "Which is better than losing quietly."
This is the moment where I need you to do something. Not for me, not for the algorithm, but for every community facing this exact situation right now in your city, my city, cities across this country. Hit that like button if you believe that corporations shouldn't be able to erase culture for profit. Subscribe if you want to see more stories about people who refuse to be inventable. Share this with someone who works in city planning, real estate development, or community advocacy because they need to see what happens when urban renewal becomes cultural genocide. And here's what I really need from you. Drop a comment telling me if you've ever seen this happen where you live because I guarantee this story isn't unique. From San Francisco to Brooklyn to Seattle to Austin, this pattern repeats. Wealthy developers target ethnic neighborhoods, bribe or pressure officials, displace communities, build luxury housing. The only thing that stops it is people paying attention. So pay attention. Now, let me tell you how this ended.
The breaking point came from an unexpected direction. Terramark Development Group was a publicly traded company, which meant they answered to shareholders. And shareholders cared about one thing above all else: return on investment. The Magnolia Heights project was budgeted at $200 million. Construction timelines were locked in. Investors expected returns within 5 years. But the protests, the media coverage, the political pressure, it was all creating delays. Every week of delay cost Terramark money in holding costs, construction penalties, and investor anxiety. And then the boycott started. Activist groups identified other Terramark properties across the country: luxury apartments, mixed-use developments, commercial buildings. They organized tenant unions. They pushed for rent strikes. They held protests outside Terramark properties in 6 different cities. The message was clear: if Terramark displaces Little Saigon, we make every property they own a target. For the first time, the corporation's other assets were at risk. At a shareholder meeting, investors started asking hard questions. Why was a $200 million project being jeopardized over a buyout dispute? Why were they risking their brand reputation over one neighborhood? Richard Voss tried to maintain control. He argued that backing down would set a precedent that encouraged resistance at every future project. But the numbers didn't lie. The longer this dragged out, the more expensive it became. One major institutional investor, a pension fund that held 8% of Terramark's shares, issued a public statement calling for good faith negotiations with the Magnolia Street community to resolve this matter efficiently and ethically. The board pressured Voss to settle. This time, when Terramark called for a meeting, it wasn't in their lawyer's conference room. It was at the Vietnamese Community Center on Magnolia Street. Richard Voss walked in without his legal team. He was met by Mrs. Nguyen, Stitch, Reaper, Mr. Pham, Mr. Tran, and representatives from 15 families. Maya Chen was there too, camera rolling. Voss sat down across from Mrs. Nguyen. "I'm here to propose a settlement," he said. "No posturing this time. No corporate language." "We're listening," Mrs. Nguyen said. "Terramark will offer fair market value for every property on Magnolia Street. We'll cover relocation costs. We'll provide 6 months rent assistance for any family that needs time to find new housing. And we'll establish a $2 million fund for Vietnamese cultural preservation in this city, dedicated to maintaining the heritage you've built here." The room was silent. "Why now?" such as Voss met his eyes. Because this fight is costing my company more than the settlement would. And because, he paused, because my father taught me how to build an empire. But he never taught me to look at the people I was displacing. You made me look. Is that supposed to make us grateful? Mr. Pham asked. No, Voss said. It's supposed to be honest. I'm a businessman. This settlement makes financial sense. But I'm also the son of Robert Voss, and I've spent the past 3 weeks reading about what my father did in 1983. I didn't know the details until your mother told that story to the press. He looked at Mrs. Nguyen. I can't undo what he did. And I can't promise I'm suddenly a different person. But I can make this deal fair. Mrs. Nguyen studied him for a long moment. Fair market value is not enough. You're still taking our neighborhood. I know, Voss said. And I can't change that. The development is happening. The city approvals are locked in. The investors have committed. But I can make sure you're compensated properly. That you're not financially destroyed. That you have resources to rebuild somewhere else. Rebuild what? Mrs. Nguyen asked. You can't rebuild 40 years of community. You can't rebuild the place where children grew up speaking Vietnamese, where old people came for medicine and conversation, where families celebrated Tet together. No, Voss admitted. I can't rebuild that. But I can make sure you have the means to create something new. Somewhere else. That night, the community met one final time. The offer was clear: fair market value, relocation assistance, 6 months of support, cultural preservation fund. It was more than they'd hoped for when this started, but it was still displacement. We fought for 3 months, Mr. Tran said. We've made them see us. We've made them negotiate. But we can't stop the development. The city has already approved it. So we take the money, someone said. It feels like losing, another voice added. Mrs. Nguyen stood up slowly. In 1983, we lost because we had no power. We took pennies and scattered because we had no choice. This time we fought. We made them negotiate. We made them acknowledge our worth. She looked around the room. This is not the victory I wanted. I wanted to stay. I wanted to die in the shop where I've spent my life. But that choice was taken from us before we even knew we were fighting. So what do? Someone asked. We take the settlement, Mrs. Nguyen said. We use the money to build something new. Maybe not on Magnolia Street. Maybe not all together in one place. But we don't disappear. We don't scatter. We stay connected. She paused. And we teach our children what we learned. That when powerful people come for your home, you fight. You make them see you. You make them negotiate. You refuse to be erased quietly. The vote wasn't unanimous this time. Some families wanted to keep fighting. Some were too exhausted to continue. But the majority accepted the settlement. 6 months later, Magnolia Street was empty. The building stood vacant, waiting for demolition. Construction fencing surrounded the block. Signs advertised the coming Magnolia Heights development. But the community didn't disappear. Using the settlement money and the Cultural Preservation Fund, they purchased a building in a different neighborhood, a former warehouse that they converted into a new Vietnamese community center. Mrs. Nguyen reopened her herbal remedy shop on the first floor. Mr. Tran's faux restaurant took the space next door. The Pham family grocery relocated across the street. It wasn't Magnolia Street, but it was something. On the day of the grand opening, over 300 people showed up. Families who'd been displaced. Supporters who'd joined the protests. College students who'd slept in tents. Hell's Angels who'd fought alongside them. Stitch stood next to his mother as she cut the ribbon on the new shop. It's smaller than the old one, Mrs. Nguyen said. Yeah, Stitch agreed. The neighborhood is different. Not as many Vietnamese families nearby. We'll build it up, Stitch said. Like you did before. Mrs. Nguyen looked at her son. Do you think we won or lost? Stitch considered the question. I think we survived. And we made them pay for what they took. Is that enough? It's more than we had in 1983. Mrs. Nguyen nodded slowly. Then she smiled, a real smile, not the exhausted expression she'd worn for months. Your father would be proud of you, she said. He'd be proud of you, Stitch corrected. They walked into the new shop together, where copper pots were already simmering on the burner, filling the space with the smell of star anise and ginger root. Outside, the Hells Angels gathered in the parking lot. Reaper started his bike, the engine roaring to life. You think Voss keeps his word about the cultural fund? Bones asked. We'll make sure he does, Reaper said. That's the thing about fighting people like that. You don't just win once. You keep watching. You keep holding them accountable. Jimmy looked back at the community center, where families were gathering for the celebration. You think this happens in other cities? He asked. Every day, Reaper said. Rich people taking from poor people. Corporations erasing communities. The law protecting power instead of people. So what do we do? Reaper put on his sunglasses. We keep fighting. One neighborhood at a time. He kicked the bike into gear and rode away, the rest of the charter following. Behind them, the Vietnamese community center glowed with light and life, smaller than what was lost, but alive nonetheless. 3 years later, Magnolia Heights opened to mixed reviews. The luxury apartments were 40% vacant. The retail spaces struggled to find tenants. The rooftop bar closed after 18 months. Turns out, the neighborhood's value wasn't just the real estate, it was the community that lived there. Without the Vietnamese businesses, without the culture and foot traffic and life that made Magnolia Street special, the new development was just expensive emptiness. Terramark sold the property at a loss to another developer. Richard Voss stepped down as CEO 2 years later, citing personal reasons. In his resignation letter, he never mentioned Magnolia Street. But Mrs. Nguyen kept the newspaper clipping about his resignation in a frame behind the counter of her new shop. Sometimes justice isn't immediate. Sometimes it's slow, incomplete, bittersweet. But it's still justice. And in the new Vietnamese community center, children still learned their grandparents' language. Old people still came for herbal remedies and conversation. Families still celebrated Tet together. Not on Magnolia Street, but alive. Unbroken, refusing to disappear.
Educational and moral lessons. Systemic corruption requires systemic resistance. Individual legal challenges fail against institutional power. Only organized community action and public pressure create change. Cultural preservation is economic justice. When developers erase ethnic neighborhoods, they're not just displacing people, they're destroying irreplaceable social capital and intergenerational knowledge. Legal doesn't mean ethical. Campaign contributions, zoning manipulation, and eminent domain can all be technically legal while being fundamentally unjust. Victory isn't always total. Sometimes survival and fair compensation are the best outcomes available, and that's still worth fighting for. Generational patterns of injustice must be named. The connection between Robert Voss, 1983, and Richard Voss, present day, shows how exploitation becomes legacy without accountability. Community power comes from collective action. The Vietnamese families had no power individually, but united with allies, they forced $1 billion corporation to negotiate. Documentation and media are weapons. Maya Chen's journalism, Emily Walsh's leaked documents, and social media activism turned a local displacement into a national story, changing the power dynamic. If you made it this far, thank you for spending the last 35 minutes with Mrs. Nguyen, Stitch, and the families of Magnolia Street. This story matters because it's happening right now in dozens of cities across America. Different names, different neighborhoods, same pattern. Powerful interests erasing communities that took generations to build. The Hells Angels in this story didn't ride in with violence. They rode in with organization, documentation, and the willingness to stand beside people who had nowhere else to turn. That's what protection actually looks like. Not dramatic confrontations, but showing up when systems fail the vulnerable. Mrs. Nguyen's herbal shop survived because her son refused to let her disappear quietly. The community stayed connected because they fought together instead of scattering alone. That's the real lesson here. Solidarity is the only weapon that works against institutional power.
If this story moved you, hit that like button, not for me, but to tell YouTube that stories about real resistance matter more than clickbait. Subscribe if you want more true accounts of ordinary people standing up to extraordinary corruption, and share this with someone who needs to understand that gentrification isn't progress, it's erasure with better marketing. Most importantly, drop a comment telling me what neighborhood in your city needs this kind of protection, because I guarantee somewhere near you a community is fighting this exact same battle right now, and they need people to pay attention. The Hells Angel write for those who can't write for themselves. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay loud, and never let them make you disappear quietly.